So first, welcome to IA in Practice. This is the first meeting of the IA office hours that has been rebranded. So some of you will have remembered that for the last 2.5 years, I've been running IA office hours. Last month, I announced that I would start having a theme for these office hours. And I subsequently have launched the IA in Practice program, which has designated a theme for every month of the year. So that is something that we are kicking off today with the theme of auditing. And before we get into today's topic, I want to introduce myself, and then I want to get into some rules. So I'm Abby Covert. My pronouns are she and her, and I am the Chief Sensemaker here at the Sensemakers Club. If you are new to the club, one of the things you'll notice is that at the beginning of each of our meetings, we do go over a set of rules. You can see that set of rules pinned to the chat, so follow along in text as I'm about to go through these. So the first thing is we do have a code of conduct in place. If you have not read that, I would be surprised because we have put it in front of your face no less than 5 times before this meeting. If you have not seen it though, there is a link to it pinned in the chat. Also, I want to remind you of some things outside of that typical conduct. So first is we really prioritize kindness here at the Sensemakers Club. So before reacting to something that somebody else says, take a pause with kindness in mind. Also, assume best intentions. Most of the time, folks on these calls are here to be helpful. So if their tone doesn't seem helpful, assume that it's something else going on in their life and has nothing to do with you. Assume best intentions, that they're trying to be helpful, and let's try to just move on. I also really ask that we do not interrupt each other. I generally see that that is most well achieved in a room this size by keeping ourselves on mute unless we are the speaker, and we use the hand raise feature to be added to the queue. So I can see a queue as they come in. I'll be able to manage who raised their hand when and such. We also have the chat, as mentioned, is in the lower right-hand corner. You can open that up if you have comments or questions that you don't really feel like should go in the flow of conversation, but maybe a note for later. I do copy those out and share them, the highlights of them at least, with anybody who didn't make it into the call. So those can be useful. Also, if you feel like being the chat detective for today's call, that is very much appreciated. If someone's like, oh, there's this great book, oh, there's a great article, you can be the person on Google trying to find it and getting it in the chat so everybody else can get to it. So we really appreciate that kind of collaborative effort. I do try to limit side talk and crosstalk both in the conversation as well as in the chat. Crosstalk is when you are talking to just one person instead of just addressing the group, and side talk would be stuff that's just completely off topic to what we're talking about. I also am totally fine if you want to have your camera or your mic off for the entire session. I call that podcast mode. However, if you only ever come in podcast mode to my sessions, don't be surprised if I reach out to you and say, hey, what's going on? Can we maybe get you on camera and hear your voice a little bit? I try to keep people to 2 minutes per response. If you see me dancing in my little box down here, that probably means that you have been talking too long. I will at some point go off mute and start to make some sort of a sound so that you understand that. And at some point I will just jump in and cut you off because I don't have the little stick that I can pull you off of stage with. And then lastly, for this session, you are being recorded. Generally, we only record by Read AI, and that is only for conduct and for review for kind of like themes. But for this particular session and all the sessions that I host, they are being recorded and they will be available to anyone who pays for access to these sessions. With that, does anyone have any questions about the new format, about what's going on in this program? Or should we just get right into today's topic? Going once, going twice. Everybody's had time to find the hand raise feature. Okay, awesome. I want to start with an icebreaker, and because we have a large room size, I'm going to do one that is in the chat. So we'll have a moment to kind of type out your response, and we'll get a good sense of the people coming in today. So the chat icebreaker that I have planned is one about your personal life. So the question that I have is, what is one place in your personal life, whether digital or physical, that has become a mystery to you? Like there's a lot there, but we don't know what. All right, we got a couple answers coming in here. Personal values and priorities. Shout out, John. Very deep. The journals. I also share that one. Digital photos. I think the photos thing, we might be able to start a subgroup on getting together to systematically archive our photos. Parenthood. I feel that one. My aging dog. Yes. Oh, beautiful. Okay. So one of the things that I wanted to highlight is that auditing is not just a professional task. It's actually like something that we have to do throughout our life in other contexts. So whether that's like your pantry or your crazy amount of digital photos or your personal values and priorities, at a certain point, you kind of have to like put it all out there and get into the nooks and crannies and dig it all out. And it turns out that the process is not all that dissimilar from when we do that professionally. So it's something that I wanted to start with to kind of remind us of the breadth of this particular skill. But the meat of today's conversation that I want to get into is actually getting examples. So I'm pretty sure that either personally or professionally, everyone on this call has done something that looks like an audit. So what I want you to do is I want you to take a few minutes to think about, and then talk to us about the last time that you had to figure out what was already in place, specifically because you were going to change it. Okay, I'm going to post that into the chat. So tell us about the last time that you had to figure out what was already in place before making changes. All right, we're starting to get some responses into the chat here. So who wants to raise their hand and share with us a recent time that they've done some auditing? Yeah, Dina.
Hi, I'm Dina, she, her in Montreal, where it's very cold. I am currently working on a contract with an organization. They have about 6 different silos of information and content creation. And I'm trying to update some things based on a new information architecture. And it's a zoo, because the more I open and read, the more I'm realizing that sometimes the information is just vastly different. So quite challenging.
Yeah. Tell us about, how did you set yourself up for it? Like, how did you start?
Basically, it's looking at the structure that they suggested we start working with and picking it apart. So as we're going through that, we're realizing that there are holes in the new information architecture design that we have to address. But yeah, going through each and every piece of information, getting kind of an idea of what they have, and then going in and starting to interview subject matter experts and finding out what actually happens, and then kind of, trying to make that align, but, trying to get all of these other teams that I am not a part of to realize that there should be one consistent story is quite the feat, because they were not necessarily preparing to do that.
Yeah. I'm glad that we started with your example, Dina, because it points out how messy this work is. Because you sound like you're doing a lot of like detective work, but then also a lot of managing up and down at the same time, which that's a really hard trio of things to be tackling.
Yeah. And also just making sure that everybody is comfortable, because there are a lot of people at this point who didn't necessarily want to be told that their information needs to be altered. So a lot of people skills involved right now.
There always is. Where there's information, there's people. That's for damn sure. All right. Who else has an example?
I'm in the midst of auditing several hundred marketing assets spanning ebooks, infographics, videos, webinars. The assets are all in one place. The data, the metadata, everything we know about them is in another place. So it's been an effort to combine those 2 sources of information, put them up against each other, create the connections, and then start to make decisions around what to do with them. What do we keep? What do we refresh? What do we retire? Stuff like that.
Yeah. Wow. That sounds absolutely hellacious.
It is to a degree. I think it's also, it's kind of the Zen part, because I think as maybe Dino pointed out, there's a lot of the human aspect, and I'm just getting into that. People know I'm doing it, but I think what I might ask of people after I'm finished with it is the next step. But I wanted to at least say, hey, this is going on, and here's what I plan to do. But I haven't, aside from getting help combining the sources of information with the assets themselves, there hasn't been much stakeholder involvement to this point, which maybe will come back to bite me. We'll see.
We could do an over under in the chat of who thinks. Okay. Who else has an example to share? we're at least getting a good sense of the broadness in the chat. Yeah, Stephanie.
So Stephanie, Boulder, Colorado, she, her. I have been doing a lot of this lately, and some of it I didn't plan on doing. It's coming as a result of having other analysis to do and realizing that everything is named 8,000 different things. Working with a ton of contractors and a ton of silos. So like sort unique on thousands of spreadsheets and putting all of the things it might be in a list has kind of been where I've been living a lot of my life. And then I think the like figuring out who to ask of these four, who is the decision maker? If it has to work for everyone and four people are calling it four slightly different things, trying to figure out how to make those decisions.
Yeah, it's like while you're collecting all the stuff, you're seeing the issues with it, and then at a certain point, the issues with it actually get in the way of your ability to collect the stuff, and then you're like, I got to normalize this data so that I can use it to do my thing. Yeah.
And Mina is very relatable, and then trying to get the people to care.
Yes. Yes. That is the hard part. All right. Who else has an example to share today? I see a lot of them in the chat. I'd love if somebody would voice us over a little bit. Jessica?
Hey, I'm Jessica, she, her. I'm in San Francisco, California. And a couple of years ago, I found myself working on a database for a large organization that they were using it to track really important assets for like regulatory compliance. But it had been spun up like super like haphazardly. And that was before I came in. So it was largely crowdsourced, and I needed to help them rename and structure like the labels that people were using to put the metadata on the assets. I needed to name them in ways that people could understand what information they were actually providing, but nobody knew like what any of those things, like they knew what they assumed users thought that the metadata was and what users thought that they were providing. But we were learning that nobody actually knew that. We didn't actually even know how the metadata was being used, where it was really coming from, if it was real, if it was fake. So I had to kind of figure out what is all the stuff that we know about a given asset, and then what does it mean. I had a very large spreadsheet that was my best friend for like 6 months.
Oh my goodness. It's like the next time that any of us are on projects where they're like, oh, let's let the users make the categories, or let's let the users make the tag set, send them to Jessica to hear her tale of woe. Because this is like every person who works in content or information has had this project at some point where it's like, well, we kind of just let everybody go to town on what to call things. And now, yeah, this is what we have. My favorite one is when I worked at Etsy, we did this for what sellers had typed into the material box, like what they had used to make the items they were selling. Do you know what the #1 material was? Does anybody want to guess before I give it up? Yes, John.
Creativity.
It was not creativity. Anybody else want to guess? Going once. Dina?
Art.
Nope.
Dang.
These are valiant attempts. Jazz?
Mason jar.
Mason jar. Hipster tears. No. No, it was love. Yeah. Which I like that story because it was also like super insightful in terms of like the way that sellers think about metadata to begin with. Like to think that that was something they needed to capture in the materials box was just really, it was really special. So yeah, Jessica, I really like that example. All right, I want to shift us over to talking about methods because I've been thinking a lot about like, is auditing really just clicking on all the things and then making a big list of the things? And I think that in some cases it kind of is, but I want to get a little bit more granular than that. So I want to know, what methods have you tried and how successful were they? Who's got a method? That's all right. Yeah, Mike.
So for the example that I included in the chat, I was working at the University of Michigan Library, got hired to redesign their website, and they had 21 different websites, and we were bringing it all into one. and it had data that went back, or content that went back to the original University of Michigan library website in like 1993. And nothing had ever been purged from it. So I had the advantage of having command line access to the server, and I just did full list of all the files. And it gave me, with the flags on the ls command, it gave me date that it was last touched, date that it was created. So it allowed me to prioritize what things were really, really old and be able to talk to someone in the unit that was responsible for that content. And in most cases, they didn't even realize the content still existed. So it really, it gave me an opportunity to start that conversation, because it's, when you're dealing with people's content, they get very possessive sometimes.
They do. They do. You're bringing up a really good point that I've been thinking a lot about in terms of auditing, is like, if you pull a list of things, or you even write a list of things, all of a sudden that list of things is sort of useless unless you've captured other things about the things. It's like the metadata on that list actually becomes what you were talking about, was like prioritization, but it's like it becomes any action on the list. It's like the alphabetical is just never going to give you very much. So who else has another method? Is anybody else taking a totally different approach? Yeah, Deborah. Up, you're on mute.
Muted. I was actually gonna say, like, kind of along with kind of along the thread of what you were saying, Abby, about how quickly things become out of date, because as soon as you create that file, if you don't have a way to actually synchronize again, you now keeping the sense of truth is so challenging that it can almost be it can almost prevent you from wanting to take it on, because it can just feel like another asset that's going to get out of date. So like trying to think about how to work with partners to make it a more like easy to keep in sync, or identify the gaps when something new gets added, etc. So it's like a tough challenge.
Yeah, that's such a good point. Because like the information environment doesn't stop moving while you're auditing it. So it's like you could just be caught in that like flow forever if you don't draw a line. But then the minute you draw a line, your insights are old. Yeah, I think that's a really good challenge to bring up. Yeah, Ralph?
Just wanted to add one aspect in the regards of the source of truth, with the example I've shared in the chat, and something I've presented several times here on previous meetings, is basically we are doing a controlled vocabulary in the context of Drupal and admin UI. And in regards of the approach, we are taking the time-consuming manual approach, going through all the pages and picking all the terminology necessary, because basically you need the context. And if you just create basic, for example, the code, it doesn't work. But in regards of the source of truth, that is also a problem we solve, because it's a fast-moving thing, Drupal, for example, and you have new issues, new features coming in each week, each day, and that way it's impossible. But one way to tackle is basically on the contribute template. We've introduced a feature that's called basically a term is introduced or a term is being changed, and that way we get basically and a tag is added, and that way we're following the tag, and that way we are able to see if something changed or got added or got removed, and that keeps sort of the sanity.
Yeah, that's really smart to have like a report specifically on change after the audit has taken place. Yeah, I really like that.
Or the audit is still underway, because it's running over weeks and months.
Well, we know anyone who's been on this call in the last 6 months knows how long you've been working on this, for sure. Let's see, Emily?
Yeah, in the example I shared of someone time I did an audit, I was auditing anything that currently existed in our intranet to see which ones were good candidates to be linked to our help desk through a label that would show up as kind of a knowledge base to hopefully deflect some tickets. And I don't know that I have a whole lot of a distinctive method from just the click everything, list everything, but I think what occurred to me during that was, it's interesting to note the point at which some kind of value judgment comes into play. Like, you start out by listing everything, but at some point, and I think somebody said this, Mike perhaps said this earlier, it's like you have to prioritize. For me, it was realizing which content would be useful in the knowledge base and which was just more like meeting notes, things we didn't want to apply that label to. And so I think even if you start out just listing everything, it's interesting the point at which either you start out with some kind of value judgment in mind that you're heading towards, or it kind of appears for you.
Yeah. I mean, I think that that's like ultimately the difference between inventory and audit, right? It's like we're not just making a list of the things, we're taking some extra step to judge the quality of the thing. And we have to determine based on the audit context, like what is that quality that we're doing the comparison on? But if you don't have anything to comparison on, then it's just an inventory. It's just like a list of pages, like what Mike can pull from the command line. Yeah.
And it might change as you go along, but
Mm-hmm. Let's see, Catherine, how about you? Two Catherines in a row in the chat. When did that happen?
Different Catherine. Go ahead, Catherine. You, Catherine.
Hello, can everyone hear me?
Yeah, welcome.
My name's Catherine. I'm in California. My pronouns are she, her. This is my first time on here. I actually just signed up yesterday, so that's why I was a little quiet. But my methods for the project I described in the chat, it was a big redesign. So the TLDR, it was for a startup tech company that had kind of grown rapidly over the space of 3 years. They had added maybe 2 or 3 more big user groups and a bunch more product lines and features. So what I would do is look at the marketing website, the doc site, as well as the features of the UI to gather the list of basically all the mentions of features, parts, and everything about them, and then put them in a Google spreadsheet. And then I would categorize the source they came from, how long they had been in the or the database, and then what changes had been made previously, because they had done previous redesigns as well, to kind of keep track of, are we going back to the same thing that was there before? Are we the direction of change, basically? Yeah, so that's the method I used. And it was pretty successful because I was able to just keep track of things over time.
Yeah. Yeah, I feel like that's something that like I've been thinking about where the source is of the kind of inventory part, right, before the audit. And it seems like there's kind of like what Mike is saying about pulling it from somewhere, like a quantitative source that you're pulling from. And then what Catherine's example is like clicking on each link and manually making the list. And I feel like those two things teach you different things. You know, like from Mike's perspective, he knows he has everything. But from Catherine's perspective, she has context on how all of the things come together. Whereas Mike, I'm guessing you were a little overwhelmed when you looked at the list of the things you had, right? But you can't be sure, Catherine, that you have everything, to Mike's point. So you can't capture the islands that have been formed from navigation redesigns, for example. So exactly. Catherine Hopper, let's move on to a second Catherine.
Thank you, Catherine. I'm also new, so this is exciting to join this community. I'm in Washington, D.C., and I'm she, her. I work for a federal government website, and so with a lot of pages. And so when I feel like the first thing I have to do is just tell people what a content audit is and why we're doing it, and try to figure out, get the reason. We're trying to align around user journeys. So looking at analytics to see what pages are people going to already. A lot of times it's not the right page we want them to go to. So we need to figure that out. So when I do an audit, I always get those analytics, like what are the page views every year and those kind of things, and get search information if I can, like what are the top searches and where are people coming into the site from that. And then just making sure we are aligned on what we're trying to accomplish, right? So that we know why we're doing this. But recently I did a project around people trying to get certain tax information numbers for individuals. And we had something like, whenever we do an audit, we'll have at least 1,000 pages, because every news release page is on there too from on our website. And some of them are really old, they're from like 10 years ago even. Anyway, that just gives you a little bit of background about kind of some of the things that I'm working with.
Okay.
And, it was really helpful to me. I did mention a book in the chat that was helpful for me as
They
I was
didn't
trying
seem
to
to hear me.
explain it for people. So that just gives you kind of an idea of some things I've been working with. And I did put a link in the chat about a book that I felt helpful about how to do a content inventory and used it to then educate a lot of other people on it. So I hope that's helpful for folks.
Yeah, the idea of including traffic data, that's something that I've seen be really important for folks, especially when you're looking for like the effectiveness of content or the ineffectiveness of content. That was something that came up on a project that I did a few years ago, was like looking at the bottom and the top of those metrics actually becomes a really nice list if you're going to do like a partial audit when you can't do, you know, a full audit of thousands of something. Okay. Maring, how about you?
Yeah, so when it comes to audits, I work with smaller projects where there's maybe a handful of asset, like, you know, there's not more than like 100 existing things. And mine is pretty much exclusively to a help center. So I'm mostly looking at one specific space. And something that I have learned over time is that whenever I try to do spreadsheets and things, it starts to get overwhelming. So I kind of do a combination of things. The thing too is like, I'm not usual. If I want to get someone's input on something, it's my responsibility to keep up with it. They're not going to go into articles on their own, or sometimes they will. But what I often do, so I work pretty much exclusively within the Zendesk space. So I use their article tags to kind of create a little audit within the CMS where it's like, I mean, and luckily to all my projects, for the most part, I'm not trying to hold on to anything that previously existed, particularly the structure and layout. So I've learned to not take that too seriously, and I'll kind of do some digging. I look at like their app reviews and things, like what are people saying, what's confusing, getting a vibe for terminology that way and within the product itself. I'll look at the previous stuff, but usually I'll look at like 2 or 3 articles and realize just how junky they are. And then the way that I make sure, I do try to incorporate the topics though. So a lot of times, so what I usually will do is, using that tagging system, I'll do like an acronym tag so it doesn't mess with search results, and just tag all of the legacy content. And then as I'm going through the new stuff, I'll just do a quick search. And if there's anything related, I'll go through, make sure anything that feels important is in the new content, and then I'll archive that, or I'll remove that tag once I know that it's handled. Because I've had the most success that way. But again, I'm usually not working with more than 150 legacy pieces of content, and then I'm creating probably no more than that as well. And I'll often try to use the previous articles too to kind of preserve those links. And so sometimes I'll just edit it directly and kind of get rid of everything and then put what I want to put in there. Because a lot of times, like anytime I've tried to further organize things, the people that I work with, it like content is just not their speed. And I feel like that's pretty normal, but especially with that long form content, like just trying to get them to review things where I cannot create that content. It's not possible for me. Doing that can be like, it's just a nightmare. And so finding different ways of doing that, usually the best success I've had is just having like a weekly call and flagging it for myself and having that organizational system to keep it in mind. But I will say keeping it in that space is super helpful. And like I'm about to pick up a project later today that I haven't touched in months, but I know that that system is there and it's all pretty much in one place. Like I'll usually have some kind of article within that same CMS that talks about like, okay, here's kind of how I'm approaching things, so I can keep track of what I was doing if I pick it up and put it back down, and any kind of like notes for future projects, I'll make like a separate article and link them out. I found a lot of success in figuring out how to use the platform it's in. Now I have the ability to do that with the work that I do. I can imagine you can't necessarily do that for like terminology and buttons and things like that. But when it comes to working within a CMS, that's been really effective for me. It's just kind of like throwing anything that exists out the window. And then if the existing stuff might be helpful, I'll find out along the way, but kind of just focusing on little things and not trying to stay married to what was previously there. And the other approach too that I try to think about is like, what can I do to make sure that in the future this, like if there is some kind of audit that happens, but also knowing realistically that like I would be shocked if an audit happened in the future, kind of taking very seriously that idea of like one topic per article, keep them as short as possible, that kind of thing, and really trying to reduce any overlap. Like the concept of mutually exclusive content has been going around with like the AI world, and I was trying to do that without a word for it before. In a lot of ways, like some of the AI things have helped shape that, because a lot of times like AI tools will learn from the support content, right? So like I'm trying to think about that too, but it's also really helpful for people consuming it as well as the people writing it and maintaining it, because when you know that there's not a lot of overlap and something changes, there's fewer places to check and it decreases the likelihood. I'm a big fan of like fewer screenshots, the better, fewer videos, the better, because frankly, people like to read. We know that through different research. Like a video is great if you have it, but most people would prefer the words over the video if they had to choose. And skim, right? Like we're going to look for words. Our brains, it's funny, like our brains seem to be wired to look for the words because that's such a big part of our lives. I did a project in college where we did like a comparison thing and we thought people would notice color changes or something in pictures, and they actually noticed the words every single time. It was really interesting. I need to find that and like or something because it was cool, and I want to see like a real person, like a real psychologist do that. It was just, I was like a freshman in college, but
I really like your example, Mary, because it's first of all, I think it's really brilliant to use the platform that you have like everything in already. So if you have that ability to like use your content management system or the Help Center platform that you're building on, like I've been in that platform specifically, and I'm like, I can see how you did that. That's really smart. And then also I like the idea of setting yourself up for the future. Like I've been thinking about how if you do an audit, and like similar to what Deborah was saying earlier, like it's immediately going to be out of date. And I really like how Maring is talking about basically creating like a process where the audit is continual. And it feels like that's such like a, you're saying that you're doing that because it's like a small set, but it's like being able to do that is just a commitment, right? It's like we could scale up something like what you're doing to a larger data set. It just hasn't been committed to. So yeah, I think there's some really good ideas there. Let's see, Caitlin, how about you?
Yeah, hi guys. Caitlin from St. Pete, Florida. She, her. And I currently work in project management, mostly production for a marketing agency. So I do auditing almost on a daily basis. Like auditing is second nature when you're a project manager. You're auditing where your project is and what your team is doing and what needs to be pushed to the front of the line, timelines. So in my example, I had inherited kind of a video production project, but it was through our production management platform. So it was really how the work got done on the digital platform and making sure we're tracking those deliverables. And it was just kind of one big mess. And the approach I took was, because you're working with humans, not just the content on the platform. I did my audit and I was like, okay, this, and this needs to be addressed. But I also talked with each one of the team members, who's actually usually, the platform is their last concern. They're out in the field doing the video, and was like, what's your pain point? What are you struggling with? Where could the process improve in your opinion? Taking that, because I can address what I think needs to happen, but if there's something that I may not feel is as important, but I want to make sure the people that are using the platform are feeling like they were heard, and then I'm coming up with a process and a flow that works for them, not just for me. So I found that really successful. They actually really loved all the changes that we made. We went from, like 30 tasks in a template down to 14, and it was amazing. They were all saying like, it doesn't take us so much time clicking around trying to find stuff. We know exactly where something lives. We know the status and what it means. So just kind of like using those, in my mind, I know what needs to happen, but framing those as like best practices with the team and being like, hey, if you can remember to do this and this over time, it's going to become second nature, and then you're going to find everything just flows more smoothly. So I found that approach to be really successful, because again, you're balancing the platform and the stuff itself, but also the humans and the ones that are using it.
Yeah. No, that's such a good note about scoping too. Like if you can use other people's priorities as your way of prioritizing, that ultimately gets you the stakeholder buy-in that you need. Awesome. All right. Any other methods to drop in this? Amy.
Hi, everyone. I'm Amy from San Francisco, she, her. I'm a content designer, so I would typically do content audits, but the most recent audit I did was actually a research audit, and it was a collaborative effort with a UX researcher. And we had 2 weeks to do it. So part of the approach was limited by like the scope and timing that we had to do this. We knew that we were looking for basically specific customer support tickets around like a particular topic that people were calling in about. And the goal of the audit was to trying to get a sense of like when people call in about this particular topic, what were like the things that they were commonly asked about. And then with the audit, we were trying to figure out like how to basically tag the customer support calls or tickets around that topic in order to find like patterns around what people were asking about and what were like the information that they got as a result of calling in. And so in sort of like the approach to it, the researcher and I, we co-designed a sort of audit plan in terms of like how we were going to go about doing the audit and like deciding, you know, what's the number of responses that we're going to look at together, how we're going to split the work of like, we each decided we were going to do like 50 responses and then decided we had to also come to consensus around like, given the attributes that we were going to audit for, what were the key phrases that we were going to pull out to consider, you know, as like, okay, these specific terminology and phrases that we see in customer inquiries represent these specific attributes. So I thought it was really interesting of like that process of co-designing an audit with someone and also having to align on like, you know, the terminology, right, that we're each going to look for within the customer responses and calls that we were auditing. And, you know, the other thing that was really key to our approach was at some point, even though we didn't get to like all the pool of responses that we decided to audit, we were like, okay, well, we're not spotting any like new patterns were emerging, no matter how many more responses we were going to go through. And so we had to like make the call of like, okay, well, we were running out of time and we still have like, you know, 30 more responses to audit through, but we were okay not, you know, getting to those 30 because we're like, okay, we're not finding any new patterns. So that was also like a helpful thing to notice and observe.
Yeah, I'm so glad you brought that up because it's like the example that we talked about earlier with users coming up with the categories or the tags, like that can happen during the audit. You can like introduce a whole nother set of trash data when you split an audit across 5 people and the next thing you know they're coming back with different values. So this idea of Amy spending time up front to collaborate on what the approach is and to sort of treat it like a taxonomy, because that is what you are creating together. I think it's a really smart thing to call out. Whew, man, there's been some really great value in this conversation. I'm learning a lot about auditing this month, let me tell you. So we are in our last 10 minutes and I have a rather juicy last question. And we're going to make this a drop it in the chat type of thing. So the way this is going to work is to close the conversation. I'm going to give you this closing prompt and I want you to all turn off your cameras and turn off your microphones. And we're all just going to answer the question. And then when we're ready, we're going to leave the meeting. And I'm going to take all of these responses and clean them up and put them into our document that'll be shared in channel along with the video. But yeah, I'm really excited about doing this program together month by month. And also I'm looking for feedback. So if coming out of this, you have thoughts on how this could have gone better, I am very open to it. You know how to find me. Okay, so our closing prompt for dropping in chat is, what is one piece of advice you'd give to someone who is just starting out on their audit? All right. See you next month.